This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, medical, or mental health advice. We speak from our personal experiences and opinions. The views expressed are solely those of the individual speaker and are not intended to malign any group, club, organization, or business.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Confronting the Line, where we explore that very fine line between transformation and exploitation, between help and harm in the personal development and wellness space. Today, I'm super excited to have with me Ben Eisenberg. I met Ben in a really great, curious way, actually. So Ben wrote about his experience growing up in the landmark world. So those of you that have been following me, you know my experience. I spent 30 years almost of most of my adult life as a program leader, staff member, whatnot, in the landmark worldwide world, Werner Erhard landmark worldwide world. Kind of some of the big kids on the block in personal development, quite honestly. And so Ben wrote this really great piece and he posted it up on Reddit. And I've been talking with enough people since my own book came out about their experiences to know it's really scary. It's really scary to actually talk about landmark and your experience, the dark side of it, the harmful side of it. And so I was really impressed with what Ben wrote. I thought he articulated some very nuanced things really, really well. So I reached out to him and offered to have an offline conversation. Anyway, then we got connected and we've been talking a little bit over the last several months. And Ben is getting ready to publish his manuscript in a much bigger way. And I think the world will be a very much better place in the industry of self-help personal development, particularly a better place for it if they take what Ben's experience and his deconstruction of that experience to heart. So I'm really excited to have Ben with me today, and we're going to talk a little bit about what he's discovered. So Ben, anything you want to say before we kind of jump into the paper and your points and tell us a little who you are?
So thanks for having me, Ann. It's a pleasure to be here. I was not expecting to be thinking about Landmark again. I grew up in that world. It was constant exposure from age 6 on, and I really thought that was a previous part of my life. After about 25 years of dissociation of trauma, a lot of memories all came flooding back at once. And uh, I was like, wow, that's unpleasant. I'm just going to ignore that and pretend like it didn't happen. And that was the wrong choice. And for about a year and a half internally, I was really struggling. And I decided to finally rip the Band-Aid off the trauma and started working my way through it. And actually, it took probably a year and a half after that to really find myself in a place where I was trying to separate who I was from what the trauma was from what was instilled in Landmark. And so I sat down and wrote for myself almost like an excavation of my own memory and trying to piece it together in a timeline to, see and understand and separate who I was versus what was imposed on me. And that was the origins of it. I wrote it really just for myself to, try to see what was there and deprogram what I couldn't see. And I was expecting really nothing when I put it up on Reddit. I'm curious how this is going to land for people. And I was really blown away by the response, and that it seems to have actually resonated with people is awesome. I built it to sort of help heal myself. And in the process, the fact that, it's resonating with other people is really cool.
We actually read, so as you now know, I have out of the response, I had a very similar response to my own book. Like I thought my book was a lot about me processing stuff and telling my story. And I wanted to warn others. I actually wanted to warn Landmark too. And then the response was really overwhelming on how many people started coming to me and still do. I mean, on a weekly basis, I probably hear from somebody new that just need some place to talk and tell their story and tell their experience. And it's hard too, because, there's good experiences and there's bad experiences and everybody wants to kind of sort it into one side or the other. And that's just not the way reality is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard to talk about because people don't want to look at that dark side. because they think it will negate the light side. And that's what confronting the line is all about. I'm like, no, go, guys, let's come to the line, look at both, learn what we learned, and let's help be a part of a
Mhm.
better industry. And that's kind of that's what keeps me sane, is staying focused on that. But we read your paper, a whole group of us that were having regular calls to just have a place to talk and share. And then I believe it also came up in one of our sessions with Rachel Bernstein, and it was so cathartic for so many people, but particularly people like you who had started their participation at a very young age, before the prefrontal cortex
Mhm.
is really developed. And so it gave language for a lot of experience that people were wrestling with but didn't know how to articulate. And so it's definitely making a big difference. And I'm looking forward to wider distribution and discussion. And I hope that, I know I'm sure Landmark listens to this. Somebody does anyway. And I hope they really listen. And I hope they actually take some of the deconstruction to heart. So we'll talk more about that as we get going. But I just want to say that up front. Like, this is not, uh, we're not on a vendetta tour here. We're on a healing tour, understanding tour.
And one of the things that I think is sort of critical to distinguish is a lot of the tools and tactics that Landmark teaches are real psychological tools and techniques. They serve a purpose, there is a proper professional use, and they are truly beneficial when used properly. Exactly, but the "but" used properly is the most important part, and that's
Right.
really the challenge with it, because people do get tremendous benefit from it. I can track benefits that I got from it. It made me, in a lot of ways, the person who I am today. It just caused a lot of tangible harm in the process, and, that's what happens when you expose the 7-year-old to some of these frameworks
Right.
or misapply them.
And I don't, shout out to those of you out there that are kind of like, fuck Landmark. I hate these people,
That was me for a while.
Me too. I just want to go, that's a stage of deconstruction. That's a stage of healing. We have to separate from something in order to observe it and witness it and
Mhm.
analyze it and like that. So, and your paper does a really good job of that. So let's just kind of jump in, and I'm going to go. I had AI kind of help me come up with a sort of path that takes us through the paper, which we will, of course, link in the notes so people know how to find it and read your manuscript. And I
Yeah.
love, the thing I love about your manuscript is you're adding to it, as your own journey progresses. So first of all, you open your manuscript by stating this is not a takedown, it's a separation. You describe the text as source code, as a lived documentation of indoctrination. Can you explain the difference between a takedown and separation, and why you felt it was necessary to document the operating system of your childhood to get free from it? You just kind of alluded to it actually a little bit, but can you speak
Yeah.
a little to that particular?
So the first in is separation versus takedown, because I can acknowledge that Landmark does provide value for people in certain contexts. I'm not coming at it from a place of they need to be destroyed or they're horrible or I need to take them down. It's this is what I was exposed to, and it regularly still colors my thinking and framing and experience of the world. And in order to understand who I am as a person, who I was before that, who I choose to be now, I need to be able to understand what was imposed and what frameworks so I can pick and choose what works for me and discard the stuff that doesn't.
Nice, beautiful. Which interestingly, I would say is sort of, I don't know what you think about this, but it feels like these, let's call them teachings. They call it a
Mhm.
technology, which is bullshit. Maybe methodology might be a little bit better, but it's like a lot of times they're saying one thing, but something else is happening. And that's a part of, I would add that to, like, you got to separate and be able to look at both those things to start
Yeah.
to find your feet and your ground. Also, I think it's worth acknowledging that a lot of what Landmark's work particularly is based in is from the 60s and the 70s. Now, that
Mhm.
doesn't make it invalid, but we've evolved our
Yeah.
understanding of
Mhm.
how the human emotional systems,
Yeah.
neuroscience has evolved a long way. And one of the things for me that continues to be frustrating is that Landmark, and I don't think they even know they're doing this, but they keep sort of defaulting to some really bad ideas, like taking people back into their trauma, their earlier similar incidences, and having them go back through them. Now, I haven't participated, I want to acknowledge, I always promised I would be honest. I haven't participated in a landmark program or anything adjacent even since 2019 when we hosted the last
Mhm.
Being a Leader course with Werner Erhard, which was adjacent, but still actually quite different in some ways. Now, they took everything we developed in the Being a Leader course and started to bring it back into Landmark. So anyway, um, just this is part of why I love your taking it apart so much. Who did you write? So you said you wrote this for yourself, right?
Mhm.
This is you going on your own journey.
Mhm.
And, but who else do you really hope that it helps? Like, who do you really wanna speak to?
Well,
Is it the kids? Is it everybody?
I came into it with no expectations other than me writing this for myself. So the fact that it has helped anyone at all is really
Mm,
phenomenal to me. And if it can continue helping, so people, it's not just landmark people who reached out to me after the Reddit, it was people who had all sorts of other trauma and experiences and found value in how I was analyzing and framing it and able to hold the good and the bad together. So that was unexpected, but and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the reason I'm talking with you now is because Landmark just brought back the forum for young people.
yeah.
I thought it was past harm that I was evaluating and processing for myself. And the moment they brought it back, it shifted from historical recreation to active harm. And that's why at this point I'm speaking out and sharing my story. I may have done it anyway, but this moment their action makes me feel like this is something I have to do.
And a lot of us had that reaction. I hadn't, honestly, prior to so many of the people who've reached out to me since my own book, I hadn't really thought much about the impact on young people, including my own. So my husband has 2 boys. I have a son and a daughter that we raised, as it were, in that world. My daughter was, gosh, I think she was about 4 when I started participating. My son was older. He was like 10. My husband's children were in that like 10, 13. But all of them did the Forum for Teens. I
Hmm.
don't know if they did, some of them might have done the Forum for Young People, but our kids did those programs
Yeah.
at least once, and I think all of them did it twice. And I would say, I can't say exactly, and we'll start going through the points you make in your paper here in a second. I can't say exactly like harm versus harm or
Hmm.
help, but I can say it didn't help for
Well,
sure.
and a lot of it is a
And they're
lot of it.
resentful of it, but I think that it's hard for me to separate where they're resentful from not having their parents around, because my
Yeah.
husband and I were just consumed, we were off saving the
Hmm.
world rather than, we spent as much time as we could, but still our life was in a bigger context than just being a family.
Absolutely, but I relate to that because for me it wasn't just landmark at landmark, it was landmark at home and in every
Mm,
aspect of life. And I'm not sure if this is correct or the memories of an 8-year-old, but I recall being told that we were in the very first ever form for young people. And again, I don't well this was I guess February '92?
well, you might have been under Landmark. I
Yeah,
believe the Werner Erhard and Associate, it's precursors.
but I believe it was, like, the end of '91 where they, like, restructured
Yeah,
everything,
it was. Yeah, you got
and that was it. I think it was Landmark Education and not Landmark Worldwide at
right.
the time.
Right. Yeah, so you might have been under the Landmark header. I don't
Yep.
recall exactly when they started doing programs with people under 18.
Yeah.
I'd be
I
surprised
don't remember who the leaders were. I'm sure a landmark historian out there will jump in and correct if the first one was not in Philadelphia in '92 and it was elsewhere. Doesn't really matter.
if
But sort of the point of where I was going with that and with your kids experience as well is it's not just a system that you go to or a 3-day weekend. For a lot of people it is, but for me and for I imagine your kids, like it becomes native fluency and the lived experience. And it was so pervasive in home and school and in landmark world with my parents and my parents' friends that was why I felt the need to do that sort of writing out my own source code and trying to separate what was what, because it
Mm,
was so prevalent in so many different parts of my life that trying to separate what happened with Landmark from all the different paths in there, and what was Landmark imposed and what was trauma response and what was, you know, original neurodivergent Ben operating system before the Landmark one got superimposed on it.
yeah. Well, so we have a couple of key themes. So the first theme that I think your paper starts to bring up really well is what is very subtle, but it's this difference between consent and indoctrination. So we can say an adult consents to a program like this, but a child doesn't really. That's
Mhm.
their parents. And I know for us, like as parents, we were just like, woo, we're going to have transform kids, blah, 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 blah. And, and the kids would be, they'd either play along or they'd be like, whatever,
Mhm.
kind of thing. And so you talk about attending the forum for young people at the age of 7. So there you are, 7. So they're not giving consent. Your parents are putting you in there.
Although, and I'm sure you remember this, the enrollment conversation, it has to be framed as your choice. Now, a 7-year-old can't understand and meaningfully consent, but in the absolute literal, I said yes because that's what happened, because
Yeah.
that's how they frame it. So just in terms of consent, and in the most literal sense, yes, I did consent because you have to agree to do it and be enrolled in the process. But yes, mostly it's just lip service, as you mentioned, or okay, I'm going to do this, and not actually understanding.
Isn't that kinda like the first manipulation? Like,
Yeah.
we know as adults that a 7-year-old and 8-year-old can't consent, right? So
Mhm.
whatever consent we're getting from them is mitigated by the developmental capacities they have.
Right.
And I do this in my safe practitioner workshop. We talk a lot about this, that there's more responsibility on you as the practitioner. And in this industry, there is such an addiction to saying, well, if it didn't work, it's because you didn't work it properly, or because you didn't fully consent, or because you didn't
Mhm.
understand, or you didn't da da da. And that is such bullshit. Like, that is the first place that I just really want to call it out. Like, no, if you are a responsible, ethical practitioner, you understand that you're the expert. You're the one who has the knowledge. Hopefully, you've done this study, you understand the work you're actually delivering, which I'll tell you as somebody at Landmark, heck to the no. We're not taught any of that. We're only taught their ideology,
Mhm.
their version, not where it came from, not what it's based in, not what the dangers are, other than the
Mhm.
dangers to the organization. We hear a lot about that, but we don't hear about the dangers to people. So, well, let's look at this thing. So, you're attending the forum, right? And then you tell this story in your paper about telling your second grade teacher that life is empty and meaningless, which they then send you to the principal's office. Looking back, how did being exposed to that level of existential nihilism as a child affect your ability to process real world events, like the death of your grandmother, which you also then talk about? So I know this is a heady question, but I thought it was really
Yeah.
good. I was like, ooh, let's explore that.
Well, so what I took away at 7 was the first part. The life is empty and meaningless. I missed the, and it's empty and meaningless, that it's empty and meaningless, therefore you get to create the meaning. I missed the part that's supposed to make it empowering.
Mm,
And
we'll
you
come
know,
to that. So,
the part of it is a lot of historical reconstruction over time. So what actually happened was the Friday of the Forum for Young People, my great grandmother died.
mm,
And Sunday evening after the forum, we were sitting around, and uh, I'm certain that my mom was not this casual with it, but that's how it occurred to me at like 7. It was, oh, by the way, Nan died and the funeral was this morning.
that's right. I forgot. So you actually missed the funeral because you were in the
Yep.
forum.
And so part of my takeaway was, wow, like what they just taught us was so important, clearly the most important thing in the world, more important than family, more important than grief, more important than anything. If like my parents decided that it was more, but now in hindsight, I talked to them about it when I was like 14 or 15, and my mom really got it because she lost her mom at an early age and wasn't allowed to go to the funeral, and
Mm,
she felt bad and really got it. And it's not really about that. It's about my takeaway in the moment was this is the most important thing in the world. And I only got that first little part of it. And I know that I only got the first little part based on the second grade story of getting sent to the principal because I went back from the weekend and the teacher said, "Oh, how was your thing?" Because she knew I went to some course or something, didn't really know what it was. And for someone who's been around Landmark, okay, you understand what I'm actually saying. For a normal second grade teacher, that's a really alarming statement. And I don't remember how it played out. I assume that the principal called my parents, who explained that Landmark was actually a program, yeah, whatever. I was not privy to that conversation, but like I didn't get in trouble beyond that. But to me, it just sort of illustrates that, like, okay, I clearly had already internalized that, like, that was the thing. And then it was
You're
compounded
reproducing it.
by,
Just developmentally speaking, at that age, at 7, your neuronal capacity, you can reproduce
yeah,
what you're hearing, but you're not
mhm,
necessarily you can't analyze it, you're not necessarily
yeah,
connected to the meaning of
what,
or the application. But Ben, I have heard from many adults who have the same thing. So you're saying this thing about, "Oh, I didn't get the second part." But that's the whole point. That's part of what
mhm,
I'm saying is they're not responsible for well, first of all, the idea I got some major debunks on the idea in general, but we'll save that for another episode. But there are plenty of adults that walk away just like you did. One thing you'll see consistently with graduates of these types of programs, not just Landmark, I've heard this from a lot of others, is they tend to be situationally very unaware. So they're very often saying kind of like inappropriate things in
mhm,
inappropriate places because they're reproducing this sort of profundity
yeah.
and they sound
Absolutely. Do you remember the landmark concept? I'm sure you do, and I'm sure you can articulate it better than I can. There's sort of three critical developmental things that occur, like at like 6 years old, or like 12 or 13, and then at
Yeah, you're
like
talking about the
18.
ring formula / strong suit formulation. Yeah, there's 3
Yeah.
key.
So, but like it's interesting to me as I go back and start to unpack it that all three of those for me were direct landmark reactions.
Okay, so now I think you're really illustrating why you and so many others I've heard, and
Mhm.
I now have heard enough to be on this side of the fence that these programs should not be done
Yeah.
with people who are under the age of 18. I would actually go to the wisdom thing under the age of
Mhm.
23
Yeah.
because they should not be done
Mhm.
with a
But
developing brain.
absolutely, but for me, that, like, core formative 6-ish-year-old thing was the landmark form and life is empty and meaningless and my great-grandmother dying, and then a massive amount of my strong suits, beliefs, winning formula development stemmed from that. And the second one, and we'll talk about this more, the Rolfing around 12 or 13 was the second one, and then the third one I could argue would be when I was about 19 and realized that, like, I had no self-confidence and was really kind of messed up, and that, like, I was able to trace it back to landmark and realize, well, lots of people get good results from it, so maybe I missed something, and went back and at 19 got the and it's empty and meaningless that it's empty and meaningless. Still was very dissociated, still had a lot of trauma, still didn't process that for another 17 years. But, like, yeah, I think all three of my, like, critical landmark development can be tied directly to landmark. So I've been thinking a lot about that, and even how, like, in the advanced course, they have you write out your sob story and tell it over and over until it becomes emotionally numb. And, like, the process of my writing out my story about landmark was almost recreating that exercise, but in the opposite, is to actually, like, understand and feel something and process it instead of deadening it.
Yeah, because you can see how you were like such a young age, you were already being taught to disassociate, which is
Mhm.
some of the things that I've come to see about this work itself. Because I'm now past the organization as a corrupt, blah, blah, blah. But now I'm really examining the ideas. And like you, I do think, particularly not as they're taught in Landmark, but they're based in very sound, science, born
It's
science.
actual
Like,
psychology, cognitive behavioral
yeah,
therapy.
all these groups have Sarah and Nippy say this a lot on A Little Bit Culty, and I really appreciate it. It's like, look, we wouldn't get sucked in if there wasn't some truth there, right?
Mm,
We're not trying to talk about that part, but we're trying to separate it and also evolve it because
mhm.
our understanding of how of us humans evolves. So let me say this other thing. So by 10 or 11, you weren't just participating. Now you're staffing rooms. So this was another thing that was really remarkable to me because it was my understanding, my husband was a center manager, that people under the age of 18 couldn't assist, couldn't volunteer, or they could in a very, very, very limited ways with their parents. And your story kind of debunks that. And then when I was reading it, our group was going through it. Many people chimed in and said, "Oh yeah, no, 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 no."
Yeah.
Now the rules there are sort of applied randomly. But you mentioned you're playing with office supplies, you feel like a kid, and then you're switching into being a powerful communicator mode for adults. How did
Mm.
the praise you received for being powerful prevent you from realizing you were actually being used? Like, tell us
Well,
a little
see,
bit about that.
I don't know that the praise was what prevented me from seeing it
Mhm,
so much as, so my parents were really enrolled at the time.
mhm.
And my dad was leading introductions to the form, and so had gamified all of that and had his winning formulas for enrollment. And so we were at the Philadelphia Center a lot, and I would go with them. And while he was in rooms, sometimes I would be in there, but other times he would be doing whatever it was that he was doing, and they would have me in the office. And that was at the point where someone would be like, okay, here, these people have signed up for the form. So, and when I say, well, it wasn't really enrollment calls, I don't think that's the right phrasing, because it was for people who had already signed up for the form, who fill out that questionnaire. It was like the distinctions call. It was the, what do you want to get out of the form? What
Right.
are you hoping to
Fulfillment is
accomplish?
actually the official term inside of
Okay.
the organization, but enrollment in the sense of the purpose of the fulfillment calls is to keep people enrolled, to
Yes.
have them show up for the course they registered for.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was, I don't think I thought it was weird at the time. I think it was just, this is my reality. And the like playing with the staplers and the stamps that I'd find in people's desks and all of that was just because I still was a 10-year-old, but it wasn't like conscious, okay, now I'm switching this off and just being a kid. It was, I'm still just a kid, but also you've given me these adult communication skills. And when you say, okay, this is what you're going to do, and here's the intake form.
So how old were you when you first started being asked or allowed to have those calls, make those conversations? So it's not like you're just in the office and you answer the phone, right? Like you're actually sitting down and dialing out to people who are registered in programs and having
Yeah,
it's more or less scripted conversation. And you were how old?
probably 11, maybe 12.
My God, that's just amazing. Because my daughter grew up very much like you, but she talks about it now. And she actually is very nostalgic about it. She got to play in the supply room and she'd get to go in the rooms and and sometimes her
Yeah.
friends would be with her and they'd get to play teacher and write on all the chalkboards. But it was
Yeah.
totally a child's experience that she never, not sure she ever volunteered actually until later. She was on my being a leader team and
I,
she was
I
quite
don't know that I ever would say that I volunteered. Maybe I did, because I definitely like staff some things. And it was usually more like they would have me run messages into the form leader or stand in the back and hold the time thing to let
Yeah,
them
that's
know that we were coming up
volunteering. I
on
mean, that's
lunch. And
they had
okay.
people signed up on the assisting program with that as part of their job. But
Okay.
these calls, so here you are 11 and you're calling people and having these conversations about why they registered and what they're gonna get and all that. I'm just curious how that happened because I swear to God that I'm sure I could be totally wrong. I'm still shocked at how naive I am about this organization, but I can't even.
I have absolutely no idea, because there were also times where like I under 14, because I was 14 or 15 when my parents finished the wisdom course, and the wisdom course leader was like, well, okay, we taught you guys how to be complete, so now you can get complete with Landmark. I suspect they've closed that loophole since. But so my parents just sort of got complete and were done, and all of their friends got complete and done.
Well, the centers, there's always a lot of there was tension between the centers and wisdom. Wisdom operated as a completely independent division, and there was a kind of internal competition for the registrations because there's so
Okay.
much pressure. But as a wisdom course leader, that was one of the things I actually got to the place where I wouldn't actually enroll center leaders into the wisdom course because what would happen is they would complete because they would get interested in their life again. Wisdom
Mhm.
was about out in the world. It
Yeah.
wasn't about Landmark.
Mhm.
Now, the reverse happened also. Some would get really inspired and turn back in and go do landmark leadership. But there was always this kind of competition and whatnot. And,
Mhm.
we were just sort of taught one, we were always to default to the centers. Whatever the center needed, that was what won. So if they
Mhm.
wanted, we just registered somebody in our $3,000 program and they wanted to put them in a volunteer program and said they couldn't do the wisdom course while they were doing it. We had to say, okay, and give up the registration. So that was, anyway, there was just this weird
Mhm.
tension all the time.
So,
Now, it does surprise me that a wisdom course leader would say something that direct.
and then all of their friends and them all left at the same time, all of the ones who had been deeply involved. But so that was about when I was 14 or 15.
Okay,
And so any staffing or volunteering or anything I did would have all been before that age.
gotcha. Okay, wow.
And so I remember being in adult forms. I wouldn't be in there for like 12 hours at a time. They'd have me be bouncing from the front to the back and running messages. But I definitely heard a lot of things that probably a 14-year-old shouldn't hear.
Gotcha.
Like a lot of adult trauma and sob stories and horror and people processing death and loss and infidelity and things that, get discussed in an adult form.
Looking back now and from the work you've done so far, is there anything you'd like to say about how do you feel that that impacted you? Because I think some people would say, well, that's a positive thing, like, I mean, I was one of those ones that let
Yeah.
my kids watch the rated R movies before they were whatever. Now, I regret some of those decisions, but I'm just curious how you felt that that impacted you.
I think by that point, I had already completely internalized that everything was a story and everything was a narrative and the framing of sob stories. So I don't think I was actually evaluating any of the content of what anyone was saying, no matter how horrible the stories were, because my frame was, well, this is just your story and you're on it. And where's the racket? And looking for the meaning and the sub messaging and the meta of what they're not really saying and evaluating where the story is and how it can be fixed. And I think at that point, I was already very dissociated and emotionally numb and not feeling anything and processing everything intellectually. And so it was all very processed through that landmark frame of, well, that's just your story.
You're actually I have a thesis. I have a theory that I'm gonna be exploring, which is that these trainings, so, and I always say these because EST spun off a lot of this stuff. So Landmark was one, like that was the direct lineage. But there's context, there's life springs, there's many LGATs. Well, LGAT is a
Yeah.
form of training, but LGAT style trainings in
Hmm.
this model. And I actually think that the prevalence of disordered narcissism and sociopathy that we seem to see in our society and how it's gotten elevated actually has links to this kind of training because this was the top personal performance training method,
Hmm.
whether you were getting it from Landmark or a coach or whatever.
Yep.
But for a whole period, 70s, 80s, 90s, particularly early 2000s, it was all about disassociating from what's going on with you, dealing with it objectively as a
Hmm.
story. The psychology term is reframing. In Landmark, it was called creating a context. I read a really interesting thing this morning. Somebody sent me an article in the Bloomberg News that's all about this one taste woman that just got sent to jail. And this is a really big case because it's one of the few cases where the of subtle psychological coercion and the
Hmm.
harms that then got acknowledged in the legal world. But one of the things that struck me in this article is it says it's talking about this woman's background, and it says both groups had links to Werner Erhard, creator of EST, an influential program of pricey, dubious self-help workshops that were rooted in grueling interrogation sessions. That's the EST reputation. S seminars later morphed into the Landmark Forum, which remains popular today. So that's kind of the setup. But the interesting part is the takeaway from many seminars of this stripe is that suffering is a choice, that difficulties in life can be overcome if you decide to see things differently. You can, the thinking,
Hmm.
create your own reality. And I thought that was like such a
Yeah.
great synopsis. And you're actually describing it in detail, how that happens. And it
Yeah.
does I'm not a psychologist, so I can't speak to the true form of sociopathy or whatever, but it creates that kind of thing. My girlfriend and I, when we were deconstructing, she literally called me one time and she goes, "Oh my God, we were training ourselves to be sociopathic
Yeah.
narcissists."
It took a little bit for me to realize and discover, it's not that I don't feel things, it's that I was trained to suppress them. And once I started dealing with that, I started feeling things again. The thing I really struggled with for years as I was trying to deprogram myself from Landmark before I actually sat down and wrote the thing was I was stuck in the how do you break the frame that there is no frame?
Mm.
And I was stuck in that sort of paradox of, well, if the frame is that there is no frame and it's all made up, how do I assign meaning to things when it's all made up? It's sort of that and the answer for me was I map out the entire framework and then I see how it works and how the machine works. And I can pick and choose which parts of it work and redefine things so.
Mm.
Distinctions is not a landmark concept. Landmark obviously uses it,
Well, they misuse it actually, but
but distinctions are
doesn't
a
mean.
really useful critical thing, and I use them regularly in my life and in running political campaigns and dealing with the people who I do. It's really useful technology, and some of it.
Can I offer you an upgrade? One of
Yeah.
the things my friend Chris Sheldon told me, one of the first things in deconstruction was to stop using the language. But what I found out of that exercise is I found myself having to stop it because it gets you out of the thought terminating
Yeah.
cliche thing. So anyway, here's what I've come up with because distinctions actually doesn't mean what Landmark says it means. The way
Right.
they use it, has nothing to do with the actual meaning in any English dictionary. But what they do present, and organizations like them, are what I think are better related to as tools. And these are psychological tools, and they are tools for influence, right? Cialdini in his, well-known book
Mhm.
now distinguishes, which is how Landmark gets to distinction, particular psychological, patterns and behavioral sets that are quite common, articulates them in a way so then you can bring them to a kind of conscious use. So what I now think of them as tools. They're
Mhm.
tools, all tools they have like you said earlier, in the right context, in the right place for the right,
Yep.
but you have to understand the tool to do that. And over time, tools get safer and safer. If you were to look at a screwdriver from 1900 versus one that's in Home Depot today, you're going to see some pretty
Mhm.
big design differences because we've made them safer. The handles are bigger, the rubber, so your hand doesn't slip off and you don't accidentally
Mhm.
hurt yourself. And, there's all kinds of
But
advancements that we've made on the tool over time as
mhm.
we mitigate it against potential misuse or harms
But
of that tool.
but then some of the issue with Landmark is the tool can't be made safer because of their inherent misinterpretation.
Ooh.
Basically, the one I don't use in any context anymore is the word integrity. So
The next line of my question is weaponized integrity. Let's talk about that.
for almost everyone, integrity has a positive connotation. And so when you look at words, they all have a valence, an electrical charge. It can have a positive charge, a neutral charge, or a negative charge. Normally, integrity is a valence positive word. Landmark defines integrity in a valence neutral way. It really becomes doing what you say you're going to do.
Yeah.
And that
More, nothing less. Yeah.
and that's problematic because there is no other. I could say, Anne, I'm going to punch you. And if I then punch you, I'm acting in integrity in the most literal definition because I did what I said I was going to do. And we'll go into the conversation of weaponized integrity and all of that. But when it's a valence neutral definition, you are removing any sort of external or moral values or judgments from it, and it can become really problematic.
To me, this is one of the underlying problems with these tools is they're I-based tools being used in a we-based world.
Hmm.
And they don't deal with that transition very well at all. They attempt to. So later when Mike Jensen and Werner, so I sat in a lot of rooms where Mike and Werner, and I hear Werner's trying to release the book that they started to write. And Mike Jensen was really more my guy. Like that's why I got involved in that project. I really had a deep respect for Mike, and he's passed on now. And he was very excited about the model of integrity, but they moved it out, like evolved it a lot from what Landmark did, but it still had some problems in that it continually gets used to dismiss morality, to
Mhm.
dismiss ethics, to dismiss, tries to put everything in this sort of plain, yeah, like you said, it's reductionist. It reduces it all to my word. And they have a little thing in there, and like in restoring your integrity, you deal with the impact you've had on others. But we've all had that experience where somebody comes to and goes, "Oh my gosh, my integrity's out. I gossiped about you. I did this and it cost you that job and I'm so sorry and blah, blah, blah. And here's what I see." And like it's just coming at you like a fire hose. "And here's what I see that I can do to, address that impact and blah, 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 blah." And most of the time you're just sitting there as the receiver of these communications going, What? You did what?" And
Mhm.
they're no, it's not a two-way street. We can say, one of my teachers, one of my landmark teachers, she was really great. She used to say to me, it's like these powerful tools in language tools, and we're 3-year-olds running around with power tools, hurting each other. And I always thought that was a great description. But the problem is that happens year after year after year after year after year after year. And program leaders can often get more abusive with them, not less.
Mhm.
So let's talk just a little bit about, so you talk in your paper about your experience with wrestling and Rolfing. You don't want to do either, but you're trapped by the concept of keeping your word, right? Because your parents are like, "No, you got to keep your word," which probably included keep your word to your teammates, saying what you said you would do, strips you of the ability to say no. So I'd just like you to speak to that
Yeah.
piece a little bit, because I thought that was a really great demonstration of when we say the weaponization of a tool like that, when it takes away your ability to say no. And I don't think
Yeah.
people would understand that readily.
So when I was probably about 12, some of my parents' friends got really excited about Rolfing. And as often happens with sort of homeopathic and pseudoscientific things within Landmark, it sort of spreads within the group very quickly. And a lot of their friends started doing it. And they started telling my parents, "Hey, you would do it. It would be great." My parents were like, "We don't know. This sounds a little pseudoscience quackery." Side note, if you read the Wikipedia page for Rolfing, the very first sentence is there is no known medical or scientific benefit to this whatsoever.
I could
Yep.
roll. It did feel like it helped me, but it hurts.
Yeah. So I had bad posture at the time, and no one was like, "You should go do some push-ups." They were like, "Let's put Ben in Rolfing and do structural realignment."
Did you happen I told you the other day to watch the movie Semi-Tough because it ties Est and Rolfing together in a really funny way.
I have not seen it yet.
Parody. So, well, for our audience, watch the movie. It's $3.99 on, Apple or Prime right now. It's hilarious. 78, I think it was made. And it's very much a parody on Est. And then they don't call it Rolfing in there, they call it something else. But that's what they're referring to. Anyway, I just can't wait to talk to you after you watch that, because
Yeah.
it's actually going right at what you're saying. And but it's funny. It's like done in a very parody way.
So they signed me up as the guinea pig for 10 sessions. I honestly couldn't tell you how many of the 10 I did, at least 4 or 5. It was so horrible and traumatic that I actually dissociated all memory of the entire thing for about 25 years.
So this is where the trauma, when you're talking about
Yes.
trauma.
This is where that got sort of reinforced for me. And what happened was the Rolfing wound up manifesting itself in my life as emotional, psychological, physical abuse all rolled up into one. And the there are a number of reasons for that. But what made it extra traumatic and I think really caused the dissociation was after the first session or two, where I was like, "He's really hurting me. I don't want to go." My parents were like, "Well, you have to go. You made a commitment. So you have to have integrity and do what you said you were going to do." And I I still have very few and very vague memories because it was all dissociated for 25 years. But I do have flashes of the screaming, crying fights with them being like, "No, I don't want to go," and them saying, "Well, you have to have integrity." And I've since talked to them about that. And I understand that they were coming from a place of love and care, and that
I
but they also understand how that was a
Yes.
problem.
They missed this. I know my daughter her trauma is, I don't know, it's quite that direct, but I'm sure, there were things that she tried to tell me and I didn't understand. And I would landmark. landmark
Yeah.
horror, like, no, 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 that's just what you're making up about it.
Mhm.
That's not what's really happening, like different things. And, and it was much more subtle. But I just can see how that so easily
Mhm.
happens. And I just want to
Yep.
share that because I want, for those that are out there listening and you may recognize this, please don't be at a rush to try and get curious and
Yep.
please let go of any shame or guilt about it, but be curious because that's how we end up learning from these experiences and not carrying it forward.
Yep.
Learning how to slow down and listen a little bit more and maybe ask more questions and not be so readily eager to jump to, well, that's just your story about that. Or, well, what really does have integrity in this situation? He's
Yep.
in pain. Like maybe that doesn't have integrity for him, like
Yep.
widen your lens of integrity. Like, because you're really
Yep.
pointing, you're
So
you're illustrating really well how something that seems good ends up being harmful.
I want to skip forward 25 years and then we'll go back
Yeah.
to wrestling. So basically, I had no idea just how impactful that was. I blocked out all memories, hadn't thought about it for years and years. And then about 2 or 3 years ago, I was back in Philadelphia and having dinner with my parents and sisters, sitting around the dinner table. I have no idea what was said, what sound, what smell, what triggered it, but the memories came back of laying on the table, of the screaming, crying fights with the parents, of me like taking a swing at the guy and trying to defend myself, bunch of other stuff and it all came flooding back at once. And that was sort of what I ignored for about a year and a half before I finally ripped the band-aid off. And the first thing I had to do, so the trauma was twofold. The first, it was actually physical, lived in my body.
Right.
I started working with this trauma informed somatic therapist who did body work, and she very effectively reset my central nervous system. And what had been like a constant state of anxiety and hypervigilance and tension right here for 20 some years that I wasn't even aware of disappeared. You
Mm,
know, I wasn't even aware that I was feeling nothing and anger and that there were other
that
things that I could or should be feeling.
mhm.
And so it was 2 tracks. It was I had to actually address the physical trauma that lived in my body, and then I had to address the sort of intellectual trauma, and that's sort of what the impetus of writing this was because the implications of it, I had already internalized all of the landmark ecosystem, but that really forced it into my body. The integrity, the I don't have the right to say no, consent is all made up because people are going to do what they want to do anyway. And I sort of, at that point, completely severed the connection between like feelings and the body and the mind and lived almost entirely in my head for a while.
I can see why your paper is resonating with so many people because you are articulating so well what I have heard from dozens, and not just young people that were exposed at that young age. I think that has an extra effect of migrating it into almost your DNA, but adults. I've heard from adults that were told, your marriage, you just need to create a new context. You need to be your word. You need to,
Mhm.
these same tools, but right up until that spouse actually tries to kill the person and they get away, like, so that's where like the misapplication.
Yeah. Or what is your role in that? What responsibility did you play in making that situation? And
But see,
where it gets really messy and problematic.
it's so where you're always in that application, which is the application of these tools. I can see why I have some friends that are like, no, these tools are just fucking dangerous. They need to be buried into the center of the earth. And I understand that perspective. And I'm still kind of in the middle a little
Mhm.
bit, but you can see where the I-ness without dealing with any of the we. My whole problem with almost all of the transformational methodologies as taught in personal development programs, I think I've seen it done and I've done work in organizations which it's much better fit there because it's got different rules. There's different rules, there's safety guards, there's
Mhm.
not working in these deep personal things you're working on. You have a shared goal and and then these tools like are really great for that kind of performance and productivity. Honestly, like I've seen them do, it's really great. But in this personal domain, you can see where constantly disregarding the external environment
Mhm.
conditions um is really dangerous. And then being taught to bypass literally your human instinctual safety systems. So both those things are happening at once. Because I had somebody tell me the story about, they got hit by a bus, literally then showed up to their assisting agreement that night. And they're like, well, who were you being that you got hit by a bus? Right. Like, and the idea is that gives you power. And look, you can kind of get it in a warped way. Like
Mhm.
it gives you a false sense of power is the problem.
Right.
It gives you a false sense of power. Well, I was not aware. I wasn't aware, and you'll make some shit up to answer
Mhm.
the person. And then you'll live in whatever that is. Oh, I'm a not
Yeah.
aware person.
It's supposed to be empowering. It's supposed to let you understand your role or your cause in it so that you can take responsibility for your actions and therefore be empowered. But it becomes really problematic. And I think that's sort of a good segue back to, so by the time I was wrestling at like 17 or 18,
Mhm.
I was already checked out. I had already internalized all of it. There wasn't like I can say no or I have a choice or I'm using these framework. It was just at this point, this is how my world is. And the wrestling coach at the time had known me since I was 6 and was very heavily involved in Landmark and the Hunger Project and the Raul Julia, like all of that fun stuff from early 90s. That's a whole other conversation. But so he was the wrestling coach and he said, "Hey, Ben, want to wrestle?" I said, "No." He said, "You can get a varsity letter." I said, "No." And he hit me with the Landmark Aikido that I did not yet fully understand. And he said, "What are you making up about it?" And I hadn't mastered the I choose not to wrestle because I choose not to wrestle. And so the result was sort of feeling like there was no room for me to say no because I had said no twice and then he landmarked me.
Mhm.
So I was on the wrestling team for 2 years, but I was not skilled. I should not have been on the wrestling team. I especially should not have been a varsity wrestler.
Mm.
And the way that the coach wound up using me was because I was going to lose anyway, no matter what. They would have me wrestle the best person on the other team, the state champion or the just absolute best. Cause it was the human equivalent of a forfeit. So they would tell me that
You were the
morning.
sacrificial lamb, like
Yeah.
literally. That's what you're describing. Yeah.
They would tell me that morning what weight I would be wrestling at. I think I weighed about 190 pounds at the time. So, and you were only allowed to bump up one weight class. So they would sometimes say, "Hey, you're wrestling at 182 or you're wrestling at 205 or one of those." And then I would either go to McDonald's and like eat 2 supersized fries and one of those like 65-ounce drinks because
Inflame your body.
exactly, or put on a trash bag and go run around and try to cut weight because, if you're a pound too heavy, then you can't wrestle at that lower weight. So they would just say, "Okay, here's what you're doing." And then I would do that and I would lose. And the better person on our team would wrestle someone who they were more likely to beat. And so like, yeah, there were actual matches that the team won because of that fucked up strategy, but, it's a little problematic. I actually didn't think much of it at the time because I was fully dissociated and just sort of accepted like, okay, this is what things are. But it was like, what, maybe a year and a half later, like right when I became an Eagle Scout, the teacher came to my like Eagle Scout Court of Honor thing and he gave a speech talking about me on the wrestling team and how amazing and empowering it was and how I chose to do all of these things. And like his public narrative of me and my experience was wildly different than my own understanding of what happened.
You can see how people end up, where most people are familiar with the Cartman drama triangle and the roles, right? So the predator, the victim, and the helper. And you can see how these tools, this teaching really, like the way you're describing it, I'm like, oh, wow, no wonder you can see so much of that in there. Because one of the things I've been struck by as so many people have started to share their stories with me is why did this environment seem to create so much space for predators, predatory people? Well, because it gave them really good tools and the lack of any kind of like moral principles
Mhm.
or whatever, like they would always say, like, if you would ask about stuff like that, if you were to ask, well, but what about morality? What about principle? They'd say, oh, well, that's a personal thing and we're not talking about that. That's up to
And
you.
that right there is why in my writing, I included some of the technologies that they have since removed or retired.
Hmm. As far as we know, yeah.
Yeah,
Because a
I'm
shocking amount of stuff has been coming back around.
so, but like the old school landmark folks will recognize that don't you ever let me catch you brushing that dog's teeth with my toothbrush. And a room full of 200 people screaming that at the top of their lungs and doing the performative thing. And it's supposed to be freeing to allow yourself to do that. But it's a ritualized shame exercise. If you aren't performing as you're supposed to, if you're not giving it your all, they will call you up on stage and make you do it by yourself in front of everyone. So
Mm,
that was one. But the biggest one and what made me think of it was the little voice in your head conversation and the way to terminate thought and rationalize your way out of everything. And there is a use to shutting down intrusive thoughts and shame spirals and things like
mhm.
that. But when it is used as it was taught originally, you can literally turn off all critical thought. And that's where it gets scary and problematic and conducive to people who want to be abusive and misuse the system.
Well, you
Because
become
if
highly influenceable, right? So when you
Mhm.
do that, you can become really, I mean, we're all influenceable. This is one of the realities we deal with people.
Yes, but I feel like I'm sort of immune to that at this point
Mm.
because I grew up in so much landmark and feel like I speak it with a native fluency. I've internalized all of the concepts to the point that I truly don't believe that moral imperatives can or do exist. It's all reality is constructed through the language that we use, and since it's all made up, should and moral imperatives can't exist because it is all made up. And when now having now sort of internalized that, not only does it make me sort of immune to the sort of psychological should pressure, it lets me explain the mechanics of the little voice in your head sort of game that they used to teach.
But
Because
what
the whole
you for
premise,
becoming a predator and hurting people?
yeah,
What do you say then keeps you from becoming a detriment to society, harmful? Like,
my
what's the
own
center, right? That keep like,
my own internal sense of right and wrong and just and fair, but I'm clear that I made it up.
gotcha. So you kind of own it fully. Gotcha. Interesting. I
But
think a lot
like,
of landmark teachers would say, "Oh, he's totally the best student ever." Congratulations, you have your PhD, which is kind of what you're saying too. Oh, I have my PhD, which is why I can point out where where this can be harmful, where this can be, which is a little
mhm.
I did in my own book too. I'm like, look, we gotta pay attention here because these are really powerful tools.
For those who don't know about the little voice and what Landmark used to teach there, the premise is basically everyone has a little voice in their head. Freud would call it, there's the ego and the
Super ego,
superego, or the unconscious and the
inner
conscious.
judge, inner critic is another term here a lot.
Exactly. And Landmark's whole premise was people have this. Sometimes people have multiple ones. Sometimes men have women. Doesn't matter. The little voice in your head exists. It just is. Now, it doesn't deal with the 30% of people who have no inner monologue whatsoever. And that's a whole separate conversation. But premise one, the little voice isn't you, it just exists. Premise two, all it wants is to be listened to and acknowledged. Actually, the premise one, all reality is socially constructed. There's no inherent meaning in anything. You have to start from that.
Okay,
Therefore, the little voice is not you, it just is.
okay.
Premise three, all it wants is to be listened to. If you ignore that little voice in your head, it gets louder, it gets angrier, it wants to be heard. So, premise four, you acknowledge it. That's interesting, or oh, I got it, or thanks for sharing, or okay. You don't have to agree with it, you don't have to internalize it, you just have to acknowledge it, and then you can shut it off because it's been acknowledged. And so, I was so good at that for a while that, like, I could say thanks for sharing in my head and then just play music and turn the music up and literally turn off all thought. And I was like, oh, seems problematic. Sometimes like you actually do need to think about things.
And you do need to feel things. That's the thing. I remember my daughter yelling at me once a couple years ago. She's like, "Mom, feel your feelings." I'm like, "I'm not? What?"
No, you're narrating your feelings because Landmark trained you to.
Yeah. That's what you bring up a really good in your writing. You write out this whole you don't grieve, you completed, and being hurt was a racket. How the language is used to teach us
Yeah.
to disassociate in a way that can be
I
really
have
harmful.
an incompletion or I'm feeling made wrong.
Yeah, I hate the whole complete conversation, makes me bananas. And then I also appreciated that you talked about this thing inside of that work also where every negative emotion is a breakthrough. Now, this is something, I mean, we hear this across so many teachings. It's a trope that I'm currently kind of pushing back on a little bit, which is everything that happens. In fact, I just wrote an article about what if we could learn from success too? Like we've almost idolized pain and torture and failure and all this stuff because that's where you learn. You know what I mean? We've like the Carolyn Meese talks about the gift that's in the thing. And look, I love Carolyn Meese. I'm not going
I
to.
hate that because I see that is exactly what I do, and I've never thought of it that way.
Is what is idolize the pain.
I mean, so I run political campaigns,
Hmm.
and I even say winning campaigns are all the same and they're boring and you don't learn anything from them. You learn from the ones that you lose and you learn from the mistakes, and you literally just fucking said that, and that makes me kind of sick to my
That is
stomach because that is a landmark thing that
it's a
I like.
landmark bug, and it's not
I
just
am
a
still
landmark.
unpacking all of this, and that is not a distinction that I had before, and, I hate that, but thank you.
You're welcome. Well, I relate to now. So we have this fabulous group with Rachel Bernstein, who is both a fantastic therapist, family marriage therapist, but also a cult educator. So we have this really great group, and it's a combination of somewhat therapeutic support, but a lot learning. And one of the things I've learned is like, I think it was these little bugs, and I keep finding in those conversations these little bugs that were implanted. And this is one recently, which is, yeah, how much we have in our society. And this isn't something I'll lay completely at Landmark's feet. It's just Landmark really reinforces it. Its teachings reinforce it. But yeah, no pain, no gain. All gain is through pain. And you see it all over in our marketing now. Like, what's the pain point? Da 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 da. Everything is about pain, 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 pain. And we're overwhelmed. I mean, it's happening now. People are shutting off, shutting out of our society, stopping. There's a big part of why people are not participating in our political system anymore because the politics have been about
Mhm,
where's the pain? Where's the pain? Where's the pain? I'm the solution to your pain. And our nervous system literally cannot take it at a certain point, and we
mhm,
shut down and we exit the scene. But the problem with that is then now the field is open for all kinds of predatory,
mhm,
you know, corrosive, corrupt, all the things that we hate, but we just can't take it anymore. Like, we just have
mhm.
to step out, and that's why I don't think it's any secret at this point that I'm basically a liberal progressive in my political leanings, but, I'm more about people. I hate the whole RD. Oh, that bullshit drives me crazy, but what I'm about is like, no, who has a positive vision
Mhm.
for our future,
Well,
and who has
and that's
the
why
skills and
Mamdani
tools.
in New York City, it was really the opposite of that, and why he resonated with people because it wasn't about pain and grievance. It was about community engagement. And what
Right.
do you, as this smallest pocket of the community, want to benefit you? How can you make your community better? It was that sort of buy
I just think
in.
we're so indoctrinated as a society, and programs like this play a big role in that. Indoctrinated as a society into the no pain, no gain message. I mean, it goes back even before these religion, oh, your sin, original sin, all that crap. So it's that we can't even see around it anymore. Like, it's just so what we see through. And look, it's convenient in the moment of pain, like it can be a bit of a salve. Okay, I'm going to learn something in this. Okay, 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 I can take it. I can take it. So I understand this is again where there's some kernel of truth in there that gets us brought in. But then, just like me in a place of, you put a chocolate cake in front of me, I'm going to have a hard time stopping at one piece. Okay.
Mhm.
So it tastes good. It feels good for the moment. So here we go. So it is like an addiction. Wow. Well, really, the other thing that you brought up, the toothbrush thing, and the little boys, hang on, because there was a little question in here. I was like, that's so good. Why do you think the organization erased some of these elements? So I'm curious about that because you keep saying like they took them out, and I have like vague memories of some of the stuff you're saying. Like it sounds familiar. You're right. I think they did. Why they did? Does that?
Because those are the clearest, most legally actionable examples and demonstrations of the thought controlling and
Mm, okay.
less flattering elements of the organization. If someone says they're a cult, they teach people to turn off all critical thought, that's not an argument that you want to be defending, and you can't really explain or justify the teaching turning off the little voice in your head without any sort of that's the one where it just in my mind it started to come close to the line of things that could not be publicly defended, and that's why it got dropped out.
Well, and I'll bet I mean, we have found so many lawsuits, like this organization and its precursors have been sued or threatened suits, so millions and millions of dollars of
Mhm.
settlements because they virtually never wanna go to trial because of exactly what you're saying. But it's interesting you just brought up they do what so many organizations do. They don't change because it's the morally right thing to do. And I'm not gonna say they never did that. I am not privy to every
Yeah.
conversation. Maybe there's a lot of good people that have worked in this
Mhm.
organization. Good, mean good in their heart. But I'll tell you, their number one defense for it's not because of my book, right? Is this a cult? Question mark. I really wish I had called it. Wait, is this a cult? Because that was like the whole book is me trying to grapple with that question. But I had been being asked that question in guest rooms for 20 years, and their number one defense is what has always been, yeah, but we don't have a single leader, except they do. They didn't, yes, Warner went off and did this other thing, but there is nothing that happens in that organization that is not connected to what would Warner do. So just like Jesus died a long time ago, but the cult, it's not, I won't call it his cult because my personal belief is Jesus would be totally and thoroughly disgusted by
Yep.
what has happened in his name, as I actually think Warner would be, and it is disgusted, which doesn't excuse Warner's old behavior either.
I
But it's
Yeah,
there.
you're giving more grace than I might be
I'm
willing
often thinking
to on that one. Because no, I
Arvin
think
has called me out on this a couple of shows ago, and he's right. It's just hard for me to not hold hope that there's good in everybody.
anything that the organization says or does is a direct reflection of Harry and Jack Rosenberg. Full stop.
That's true. Yeah.
The mythos, the Warner wouldn't stand for, this is his company run by his brother, protector of his legacy, Ghost in the Machine. He and they decide what is acceptable. They don't add things, they don't remove things without it coming from the top. I do not believe that a Rosenberg was not the one who said we need to stop teaching the little voice thing. They don't remove technology or
Right.
quietly retire it unless, because that,
Always for.
when I was growing up, that was like one of the most fundamental, one of the most base doctrinal things that they taught at the beginning of every single form.
Gotcha. I
And
remember hearing stuff about the little self and big self, but I feel like that was all more inside of leadership development. But look, I did the Landmark Forum in '96, I think. By 2000, anything I did after that I wasn't doing programs. I was
yep.
in leadership develop. I was on the inside by then. I
Mhm.
wasn't, doing the whole. People ask me now, still always, well, what do you think now? Is it a cult? I think absolutely it's a cult now. I mean, what I've learned since my book came out is like, yeah, even though that's still kind of hard for me to say sometimes. So then people want to know, well, if I do the forum, am I in a cult? And I said, well, you got to answer that question for yourself. But I think you're for sure participating in a program being put on by a cult, and you are now in the tractor
Yep.
beam.
That is the distinction. And where it gets really slippery is the post form enrollment. When you go through Landmark, you feel all really excited by all the possibilities in your new life, and you're empowered by all of these things that you want to create. And in order to create the possibilities and enroll other people in the possibilities that you create, you need to give them a shared framework for what you're creating. And the easiest, best way to do that is by having them take the landmark program. So it sort of grows out virally and exponentially that way. What is a cult? And that's a really technical question and
To me,
kind of
it's an
hard to
over
define, but
question.
like
Like,
yeah.
it's not really the most relevant question, actually. It's like,
Right.
is it
But
harmful?
it's the sort of internal peer pressure network sales effect that makes it sort of insidious. The hey, you feel great and this is wonderful, and now you have to get everyone you know to do it as well so that they can be in your new reality.
Right. You tell a story about a childhood friend named Zach, right, who died of cancer. And then you
Mhm.
realize later that your internal system had deleted him. And you talked a little bit about this because his death didn't create possibility. I kind of keep coming back to this point because I think it's a really important one
Mhm.
about how everything gets recycled. But that what we end up with is a system that prioritizes magical thinking and possibility and da
Mhm.
da 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 da. Because we're not even talking about the whole intention narrative and how it lives thoroughly and completely inside of Landmark while pretending it doesn't. They make fun of all those magical thinking people while completely teaching you a kind of
Mhm.
magical thinking, but it's dressed up as possibility, right? So you're
Yeah.
inventing this reality of possibility, and it forces us to edit our own lives. Like, it forces
Mhm.
us to not deal with some of the things that there are to deal with. And this,
Yeah.
for sure, I would say, was one of my issues and why I didn't see for a long time what was really going on with my own daughter, because I was constantly immediately flipping it, like you said, into a possibility. One of the
Yeah.
reasons when I retired out of my Landmark leading and staff career, part of what was there for me is I noticed I was getting a little freaked out by like how much I no longer reacted at all to people's trauma. Because
So
you said as a kid, I would go like, oh, no, 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 that'll be fine. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. We'll just recontextualize that and you'll be fine.
I got that same thing too, but I use it as a superpower in work,
Huh?
in crisis management and
I was
PR
gonna
and
say, in
running
these
political
tools and
campaigns around the world.
organizational and those kind of environments actually are much more useful. And not only much more useful and applicable, but then there's usually guardrails in place around, like there's HR, there are ethical standards, there are, I mean, our accountability structures suck, let's not lie, but there's at least some. So,
There should
uh,
be.
yeah. Well, it's interesting. This article I was reading this morning about One Taste really, or no, it was a great piece on Facebook. I'll just send it to you, where this person just did this most amazing takedown about the Deepak Chopra is now like mentioned in the Epstein papers like a gazillion times, right?
That's a name I haven't heard in a long time.
I know. My God, I'll have to send you this thing. It's so funny. But anyway, but it's speaking all to this possibility, magical thinking, and how that then gets commoditized and used. But in an organizational environment where you're working as a team to accomplish something, that the tools
Mhm.
really make great sense,
Yeah.
and they are much easier, more easily held in their appropriate use. It's way pricey. We need to screw in this screw. We need a screwdriver. It's like
Yeah.
that
Well,
versus this.
and I think, like, to answer your question about Zach, a
Mhm.
lot of that is retrospective reinterpretation and my looking back as an adult and being like, what happened? Because what's so is I had a handful of memories of having a friend named Zach when I was like 5 or 6 years old. Couple flashes of memory. And then I have a memory of being in fourth grade and the teacher. And again, I'm certain that they were not this cavalier with it, but like the way I heard it was, oh, by the way, you guys remember Zach? He died. And like I did not actually process his death or even like put it together, think about it for years and years and years. That was in that same category of things like with Rolfing, where I had no memories, no thoughts of it. And it really, like, once I started unpacking a lot of my, first it was unpacking the Rolfing and landmark stuff. And then I was able to get to some of the stuff that was under it that I hadn't really thought about. So when I was, I guess, 5 years old, John Hines, who was the senator from Pennsylvania at the time, he was flying back in Philadelphia and the landing gear in his plane didn't come down. And they sent up a Bell helicopter to go look, and the helicopter and the plane collided, and a ball of fire rained down on an elementary school.
Mm,
Well, that happened less than a mile from my house and less than a mile from my kindergarten. So like they're all in a triangle. And I have limited memories of that. I remember hearing sirens and I remember like parents showing up at school and crying. It was close enough that I had to have heard it. I had to have smelled jet fuel and stuff like that. And I had a lifelong, no longer now, but like for many, many years, a sort of like trauma panic response anytime I heard a helicopter overhead.
When you didn't know why. Yeah, we just did
Yeah.
a great episode with Ann Betts and Brian Arbor
Hmm.
talking about this conflation between choice and trauma and how a lot of self-help practitioners try to
Yeah.
use choice as a way out of trauma,
Hmm.
why that doesn't actually work, and you just described part of it. It is in part
Yeah.
because you have these physiological responses. Brian made the point so well, language ain't gonna work on those. You gotta
Yep.
work those from the body.
And then in the same way with Zach dying, I like didn't process it at the time. It was when I was processing all of those other things. I was like, wait, I think I had really close friends who died and couldn't remember details of any of that. And when I was going back through a bunch of elementary school through high school files on Dropbox, because I still have all of that stuff sorted by year, I found the autobiography that I wrote of myself in like fourth or fifth grade. And, like 10-year-olds don't have a whole lot to write about, but I did it year by year, and I saw in kindergarten and in first grade, I was talking about Zach and how we were friends and would play together. And then second grade, third grade, there's no mention of him at all when I list my friends, and he just like disappeared. But that document showed me his last name, which I didn't remember. And then I was able to Google him and I found the obituary, and it was like, yeah, he died of cancer at 9 after like a 2-year battle. And I was like, okay, that actually makes sense. And then started putting together like, okay, I physically deleted him from the story and thinking about the implications of that and tying it in. So it was not something that like I understood or was conscious at the time. It was by that point, I had already so internalized the landmark stuff that that's just how I processed it or didn't process it. And it's that sort of reinterpretation as an adult of here was the teaching, here was what happened, here's how those connect.
Yeah, and there is a natural process in the human brain where if we think we're not able to handle something in our nervous system or whatnot, we forget it. Like, I mean, because I had a whole incident where my mother was literally held prisoner in our house for 3 days. My sister and I were
Mhm.
kept away. She was raped and beaten and da da da. And then she like gets away. She gets out when he passes out and grabs me and my sister, and we run down the alley and we escape. I completely didn't remember any of that until I was 13. And then all of a sudden the whole memory came in.
Yeah,
Is a very common piece. But I see what you can see the point that you're pointing to as well is that these teachings sort of aid and abet that. And that again, it's the line. There's a line up to which that
yeah,
might be healthy. And then there's a point
mhm,
where it's no longer
yeah,
healthy. And what I'm seeing as I age, and I've got all these people around me who have been in Landmark for years and years and years, addressed, unresolved, unexamined trauma does not age well. I mean, it manifests, and that's what's happening a lot in our Rachel group now. We're not even working on a lot of people aren't even yeah, we've come to understand a lot about our Landmark participation and how that kind of kept us distant from or covered up things work that we needed to
yeah,
emotionally, psychologically do. It kind of gave us, again, like we talked earlier about a false sense of power.
yeah.
This idea that I'm responsible for the bus hitting me gives me this like sense of I have ultimate
Right.
dominion over all buses.
But at the same time, it's not like someone at Landmark said you need to erase Zach or you need to forget
Yeah.
about him. And it's not like it was a conscious choice on my part to say, oh, this hurts too much, I'm gonna ignore it. It was by that point I had so internalized all of the doctrine that that was the logical conclusion
Well,
of
null and meaningless. Back to the
it.
7-year-old Ben, right?
It exactly, and that's my core issue with the forum for young people. If you're an adult, if you have a fully formed personality, if you wanna join and get something or not get something or get sucked into it, that's your choice. But when you are imposing doctrine before people have a fully formed sense of self, it then replaces the sense of self. And that's where these problems occur.
Okay, so that's a beautiful setup, and we'll kind of like move to the end. Well, I'm sure we'll be having many more conversations. But you are about to this episode will probably air after this has happened. But you are about to you've published this in some places. You've continued to add to it. You're about to publish it in a lot more places. This your manuscript, you call it, your paper. It's very good, folks. I will definitely be linking in the show notes to it and encourage anybody who's been a part of groups like this at any age to read it, because it's your articulation is just so helpful. But you are about to, send a letter to Harry Rosenberg and offer him the opportunity to be a part. It's not kind of akin to what at the end of my book, I kind of issue a challenge like, hey, the perfect people to move into the seek safely movement to make that, thing are the people who have been in this industry and who are willing to look and learn and admit to their mistakes and do better. And like, to me, that is, it's a powerful thing. I recognize that our society is currently organized in a way that makes that pretty dangerous because of
Mhm.
the way our laws and systems work. So I understand that. But I don't care. If anybody has the courage to step up and step into this, it should be organizations like this. And so you're about to kind of issue a bit of a challenge. Anything you want us to know about that? Because I think it feeds right onto
Yeah.
exactly what you're saying there.
So Landmark claims to act in integrity and they claim to teach integrity. So I figure let's give them a live integrity test. So I wrote the manuscript. I originally wrote it for myself, and it ended at the time with Landmark didn't end, it just went home. And it was sort of like a open-ended cliffhanger thing. I didn't know where it was going to go. Actually, that wound up being the first chapter in like a 40 chapter book called, How the Hell Did I Wind Up Here? Stories that sound mostly fake but aren't, which may be coming out at some point. It was after I wrote the first one and I had the line, "It just went home." I was like, "Oh, I should probably write a chapter about home and all of that." And it just
Mhm.
sort of evolved into a whole larger project. And I was sort of sitting on it for a while, thinking about, okay, what am I going to do with it? Am I going to share it with people? And after I posted it on Reddit and started seeing, or posted the excerpt and started seeing the response I was getting, I was like, oh, like this might actually be beneficial to people and might help some people. And I started thinking about what I would want to do and what I would want Landmark to see or think or say about it. And I realized that my career is effectively narrative development and strategic management and narrative warfare. Crafting messages and telling stories, and I use a lot of the tools that I got in Landmark, and I use a lot of the sort of trauma honed responses and skills that I developed. So I build strategic and narrative architecture around the world. I was like, okay, let's make a live integrity test for Landmark. So I wrote a postscript for the document, and it starts with talking about the experience of writing it and the response I received from other people. And it looks at some of the other young people who were in my life doing the forum for young people at the time who are still in my life, and I shared the document with them, and it was interesting to see their reactions. But once Landmark brought back the forum for young people, I said, okay, we need to actually give them an opportunity to act in integrity. So I finished the postscript with when I was a kid, I loved the choose your own adventure books.
Mhm.
All the endings are already written, and you have the appearance of choice, but in fact, all of the endings are already written.
Mhm.
So I send Landmark the manuscript and the postscript framed as a choose your own adventure, where I tell my story, they read it, they process it, and they do one of four things. They either are silent and completely ignore it, which to me validates that they read it and understand it and recognize the harm, and they're like, we can't touch this. Or deflection, where they read what I say and then give me the landmarky, well, that was your experience and we understand and thank you for sharing, and a lot of people have good experiences. And or the third option where
We
they
throw in
Mhm.
they'll throw in they've changed because they keep changing, they keep reinventing, but they keep ending up right where they started.
Yep. The third ending I scripted for them is the legal ending because they default to threatening and cease and desist letters and lawsuits. And to me, that would be hilarious because they really don't want discovery and depositions and a lawsuit, and cease and desist letters are meaningless. Have no agreements or contracts with them. I never signed an NDA. I'm not an employee. I'm not subject to any of that. So this is my lived experience. There's nothing they can do. But if they threaten me, that shows just how threatened they are by the work. And then ending four is they step into integrity and they discontinue all youth programming immediately worldwide and acknowledge harm. And those are really the only four ways that they can actually react is silence, deflection, aggression, or integrity. And so by writing all four of those endings for them, now they get to choose which one they're going to do.
One of the things I'm curious about that just strikes me as you were telling me this is act in integrity, act in integrity. So by their own model, why? I'm just curious, like, so you have your experience, you've outlined it really well here. You've shown us how internalization of these tools have set you up for harms, psychological harms, particularly, and some physical harms in your life. But that's so easily the problem with personal experience is, and personal witness is that you just say, okay, that's Ben. So, and then we line up 10 Bens. I mean, I'm starting to introduce you to all kinds of people. You are not the best articulated version, but in my experience, virtually every person I've talked to that's been willing to actually go, I think everything here wasn't perfect and great and transformed. 201, they all agree the program should not be done to people who are under the age of 18 and with a developing brain. Center managers, S trainers, like a lot of people. But many of them aren't speaking up yet. So I'm just curious about what's your measure of with integrity? Like, because they're going to it as, okay, that has integrity for Ben, but not for us.
Right. So part of the structure of it is the email to Harry and the endings are written entirely in landmark language. And so it's sort of, I'm not challenging the organization, I'm challenging the doctrine and the ghost in the machine. And in order to push back and say, well, that's just your definition of integrity, they have to undermine their own doctrine in the process because the entire thing has been framed and explained in Landmark's own language.
But don't they just have to say there's no evidence of harm?
I mean, they can say whatever they want. My lived experience, my narrative, what I wrote, the experience of other people are tangible harm. And if even one child is harmed or imprinted by this doctrine, that is sufficient to not be running programs for 8-year-olds.
Yeah. And I think therein comes in a bit of the crux of the problem. And we will definitely be following the story to see what happens with huge curiosity, because that's been one of the things as I've talked to a lot of staff people. I mean, and I facilitate or host a group of a lot of about around 300 former people, not all Landmark, but most of them, some from other groups and organizations. And this is kind of a frequent debate. How much harm is too much harm? Is it one person? Is it two? If it was just the staff being harmed, does that mean the programs valid? Like, where is that line? And I don't have an answer for that yet, other than my own personal answer. One is too many. Like that's,
and I don't need them to have an answer because I know that there is no circumstance in which they will discontinue youth programming or admit that it caused past harm. That cannot occur. So am I challenging them to act with integrity? I know how this is going to go before I do it, but giving them a public opportunity to act with integrity and institutional maturity to me feels like the right step before I really start talking publicly and explaining the harm. I'm giving them an internal chance to look and recognize, and I would happily praise the institutional maturity of them if they were to do that. But no, I fully expect them to try to redefine integrity, to try to prove to me, oh, we're acting in integrity, but by definition, they can't be.
yeah, well, and unfortunately, most of this stuff is not going to get weighed out in a court of law, as it were, which is our very imperfect system's way of talking about this stuff. Yeah, wow. Well, I am really interested in following this story and following where it goes. And I really actually like and appreciate that you're giving them an opportunity to be a part of it, because I think for those of us that have been deeply involved in an organization like this, the part that's really hard to reconcile is the whole time you were thought you were a part of something that was in an active engagement of transforming, of evolving,
Mhm.
of moving, and that what did have the courage to look at itself and did have the willingness to step up and see where they've, inauthentic about
Yep.
their inauthenticities, blah, 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 whatever. That was that was an era.
Yep.
But so I appreciate personally that you're giving them the chance
Mhm.
to participate
Yep.
in this conversation. And so far, I'll tell you, I've told you this privately, but I'll tell it here on online. I made the brave, honestly, big choice to step out and speak publicly. It was the scariest thing I've ever done.
Mhm.
But I did it because, well, one, we had exhausted every other way that it could be done. And in 2 years, they have yet to step up and participate in the conversation in any way, shape, and form that
Mhm.
is beyond the so disappointingly typical corporate bullshit
Mhm.
of, hiding, obfuscating, many
So,
times it's like, staff members were harmed. You've paid out
yeah.
millions of dollars in lawsuits. Why don't you contribute towards the Rachel Bernstein group and
Yep.
encourage staff members who feel they've been harmed to go heal? And you can financially subsidize that. Like, it's real steps. It's not
Mhm.
some document with a set of principles. No, you got to do.
Real steps would absolutely be great. For me, I am coming into this with 0 expectations, so I feel like I can have no unfulfilled expectations. I have pre-scripted the 4 endings. Landmark, if you haven't responded by the time you watch this video and you're watching this, I challenge you to come up with an ending 5. That would be interesting. It would be a pleasant surprise. Maybe you understand it better than I think you do. And I hope they do. I hope that there's someone in that organization who understands the doctrine as well as Harry and Jack. Cause it doesn't seem to me like there are that many. And I feel like I and your kids and a lot of the young people who grew up in it and who were exposed to the doctrine before they had fully formed senses of self speak the language and the architecture and the doctrine more fluently than the founders.
Well, and have evolved it in certain ways because they have lived it, and, it's been
Mhm.
around long enough now, and again, just shout out to all the other organizations that have taken it, and I just hope that they're listening, and I hope that they're learning, and I hope they do make change. I'm skeptical, but I will be following with interest.
Yep. They're going to be pretty upset when they find out that you and I are talking.
Probably, I don't know. Yeah, I don't, one of the things that both y and this is emphasized in your story as my story as well, part of speaking up is reclaiming yourself, claiming yourself distinct from whatever highly influential thing you've been a part of, whether it's a relationship, a group, an organization, a
Mhm.
religion, a doctrine, whatever it is. One of the most challenging and most miraculous aspects of being human, near as I can tell, is our autonomy. It comes with huge responsibility, comes with lots
Mhm.
of, lots of variation and experience. But it's my belief now, like, that's what we're here for. We're
Mhm.
here to experience this life and to learn, but not just for ourselves, for all of us. For all of us. And that's where I think the future lies is us waking up to the we factor. And so more about that too as we move forward. But thank you so much. I think we'll pause it here. This is a good spot.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I look forward to much more, and I'm introducing you as well to Lindsay, and I know, hopefully you 2 will partner a little bit on the Children of the Forum take, because I think this piece about the impact on humans with a still developing brain is quite distinct from adults, even though
Mhm.
in your story, I see so many correlations. Like, there isn't anything you said today that I haven't heard out of an adult person as well, but I can see how deeply implanted and much more impactful it is when you're exposed at such a young age to these kinds of ideas. Yeah.
Mhm.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ben. More to come.